She trusted him with her life, but he took it instead. Jasmine, just 18 years old, was murdered by her own uncle, the town's sheriff, a man sworn to protect and serve. In a quiet Florida town, Sheriff Michael Johnson was a symbol of law and order, a man entrusted with the safety and trust of his community. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of authority and respect. But within the walls of his own family, a forbidden relationship was forming, one that would shatter everything his badge was meant to protect. 18-year-old Jasmine Turner, a bright and spirited young woman, had her entire life ahead of her. She was his niece by marriage, connected to him not just by bloodlines, but by the fragile threads of family trust. Yet, their bond crossed lines that should have remained unbroken. The whispers began innocently enough, rumors spreading like wildfire through the community. When news of a pregnancy surfaced, the scandal ignited tensions that could no longer be contained. The very sheriff sworn to uphold the law found himself entangled in a web of secrets and betrayal. But no one could have foreseen the horror that would follow. A grisly murder that would leave a family destroyed and a town in shock. How did this relationship evolve from hidden glances to a crime that defied comprehension? What led to such a violent and tragic end? Stay with us as we unravel a story of power, trust, and unimaginable loss. A story where each revelation brings more questions than answers. By the end of this video, you'll know how it all unraveled, but you may still be haunted by the truth. Nestled in the heart of Central Florida was Madison County, a quiet, unassuming place where life moved at a slower pace. Home to just over 20,000 residents, it was the kind of town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Churches dotted the streets, kids played in open fields, and the sheriff's department was a pillar of stability and trust. In a community like this, law enforcement wasn't just a job, it was a badge of honor, a role that symbolized safety and order. The center of that trust was Sheriff Michael Johnson. Known for his no-nonsense approach to justice, Johnson had spent over 2 decades serving the people of Madison County. Tall, confident, and always composed, he was a man who commanded respect wherever he went. Under his leadership, crime rates remained low, and the community felt protected. To the outside world, he was the epitome of integrity, a man whose life seemed to revolve around family, faith, and duty. But the reality behind the badge was far more complicated. Jasmine Turner was just 18 years old, a young woman with dreams of leaving her small-town roots for something bigger. Jasmine was bright, with an infectious laugh and a determination to make her mark on the world. Growing up in a working-class family, she was no stranger to challenges, but she faced them with a resilience that made her stand out. She was also Sheriff Johnson's niece by marriage, connected through family gatherings, holiday dinners, and the kind of casual closeness that small-town families often shared at first glance. There was nothing unusual about their relationship. Family ties often blur the lines of formality, and Johnson was known to dote on his extended family, especially Jasmine. To outsiders, their interactions seemed warm but innocuous. But as time went on, those closest to them began to notice subtle shifts, longer conversations, private moments that seemed out of place, and a growing tension that was hard to ignore. Their connection, it would later be revealed, wasn't just familial. Jasmine, young and impressionable, found herself drawn to the man she had once seen as a mentor figure. For Michael Johnson, the lines of authority, morality, and family loyalty blurred in ways that would prove catastrophic. Their relationship crossed a boundary that should never have been tested, turning a trusted family bond into a dangerous secret. Complicating the situation further were the deep racial and societal dynamics at play. Jasmine was black, a fact that, in the context of a conservative town like Madison County, added another layer of tension to the scandal. Sheriff Johnson, a white man in a position of power, was not only defying societal norms but also exploiting the very trust his role demanded. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of his family. It was a betrayal of the community that looked up to him. As the affair progressed, the whispers began to spread. Family members grew suspicious, neighbors exchanged knowing glances, and the trust that once defined Sheriff Johnson's reputation began to erode. Yet, the full extent of their relationship, and the consequences that would follow, remained hidden for months. But beneath the surface of this seemingly quiet Florida town, a storm was building. It wasn't just the scandal of the affair or the revelation of Jasmine's pregnancy that would shock Madison County. What was coming next would leave an indelible mark on the community and forever change the lives of those involved. And it all started with a single, devastating act. One that no one saw coming, but that would unravel everything Sheriff Michael Johnson had worked so hard to protect. For months, the whispers surrounding Sheriff Michael Johnson and Jasmine Turner had been just that, whispers. But the truth of how their relationship began paints a far more complicated and troubling picture. It started innocently enough. Jasmine, fresh out of high school and uncertain about her future, had often looked to her Uncle Michael for guidance. He was, after all, a respected figure in the family, someone who seemed to have it all together. Sheriff Johnson, for his part, had always taken an interest in Jasmine's life, offering advice about her aspirations, helping her navigate challenges, and lending a listening ear whenever she needed one. But somewhere along the way, those familial bonds shifted. What began as mentorship turned into something more personal. Jasmine began spending more time at Michael's house under the guise of family visits, and those interactions became increasingly private. It started with subtle gestures, a hand lingering too long on a shoulder, compliments that felt overly familiar, conversations that veered into deeply personal territory. Small, seemingly insignificant moments that, in hindsight, marked the beginning of something far more inappropriate. For Jasmine, the attention was intoxicating. Here was a man of authority, someone she trusted, paying her the kind of focused attention that she had rarely experienced before. At 18, she was just beginning to navigate the complexities of adulthood, and Michael's charm and authority blurred the lines of what was appropriate. For Michael, it was something darker, a dangerous crossing of boundaries that he justified to himself, despite the power imbalance and the family ties that made it morally reprehensible. As the relationship deepened, secrecy became their shared burden. They communicated through burner phones and met in locations far from prying eyes. Jasmine lied to her parents about where she was spending her time, while Michael crafted airtight alibis to ensure no one in the department would suspect a thing. For months, they lived a double life, fueled by the thrill of their hidden relationship and the belief that they could keep it concealed indefinitely. But secrets like these rarely stay hidden for long. By late summer, Jasmine began to notice changes in her body. Missed periods, fatigue, and bouts of nausea that couldn't be ignored. A trip to the local clinic confirmed her suspicions. She was pregnant. At first, she was overwhelmed with emotions. Fear, confusion, and a glimmer of hope that this child might somehow bring clarity to their complicated situation. But when she told Michael, his reaction was far from comforting. Sheriff Johnson, a man known for his control and composure, unraveled. The news of Jasmine's pregnancy hit him like a freight train, shattering the illusion of control he had so carefully maintained. He knew the stakes. A pregnancy would mean the end of his career, the destruction of his family, and the loss of the respect he had spent decades cultivating in Madison County. He urged Jasmine to keep the pregnancy a secret, even pressuring her to consider options that would make the problem go away. But Jasmine, despite her youth and vulnerability, refused to be silenced. For her, the pregnancy wasn't just a complication. It was a life, a consequence of their actions that couldn't simply be erased. The tension between them grew, and their once covert relationship became a source of explosive conflict. The very thing that had once drawn them together was now threatening to tear them apart as the weeks went on. The strain of their secret began to take its toll. Jasmine confided in a close friend, unable to bear the weight of her situation alone. That friend, alarmed by what she heard, told her parents. Soon, the whispers in Madison County turned into a roar. Family members confronted Michael, demanding answers. And for the first time, the community began to question the man they had once held in such high regard. But as the pressure mounted, Michael didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down on his secrecy, taking increasingly desperate measures to silence the growing storm around him. Jasmine, meanwhile, found herself caught in a nightmare she couldn't escape, her trust in the man she once idolized now replaced by fear and uncertainty. The revelation of Jasmine's pregnancy was the turning point, the moment when the carefully constructed facade of Sheriff Michael Johnson's life began to crumble. But it was only the beginning of a story that would spiral into betrayal, violence, and tragedy. Because while the truth was beginning to emerge, the most shocking chapters of this story were yet to be written. As the pregnancy progressed, so did the unraveling of Sheriff Michael Johnson's carefully curated life. What had once been a secret affair hidden beneath the surface of family gatherings and casual conversations was now out in the open, and with it came the weight of the world. The first crack in the facade came from Jasmine's family. Her mother, a strong and protective woman, had noticed changes in her daughter's behavior, longer periods of silence, an increasing sense of unease whenever she was asked about her whereabouts. At first, Jasmine brushed off her mother's questions, but the growing physical changes couldn't be ignored. It wasn't until Jasmine's friend had confided in her own family, and those rumors began circulating, that the truth began to seep into the open. One evening, Jasmine's mother confronted her directly, demanding to know what was going on. With tears in her eyes, Jasmine confessed the truth. She was pregnant, and the father was none other than Sheriff Michael Johnson. Her mother, stunned and horrified, couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. How could this have happened? Why hadn't Jasmine come to her sooner? But the truth was undeniable, and the impact of that revelation sent shockwaves through the family. The fallout within the Turner family was swift and brutal. Jasmine's father, a man known for his quiet strength, was devastated by the betrayal. The idea that his daughter had been taken advantage of by a man they had all trusted, someone who was supposed to protect them, was unthinkable. Family members who had once revered Michael now demanded answers, confronting him directly about his actions. Sheriff Johnson, ever the authority figure, attempted to control the narrative. He tried to downplay the situation, claiming it was a mistake, something that could be swept under the rug and forgotten. He urged Jasmine to terminate the pregnancy, telling her that this would be the only way to avoid further ruining their lives. But Jasmine, resolute in her decision to keep the child, refused. This rejection of his authority, the first real challenge to his control over the situation, fueled his desperation. In the days that followed, Michael began to spiral. He was no longer the calm, collected sheriff everyone knew. He started making threats, insisting that if anyone found out about the affair, it would destroy both of their lives. The pressure to keep the secret grew, and Michael's actions became more erratic and aggressive. On multiple occasions, family members overheard shouting matches between him and Jasmine. The sheriff demanded that she keep quiet, that they could somehow manage the situation without anyone knowing the truth. But Jasmine could no longer live in fear of the man she had once trusted. As the weeks passed, the tension in Madison County reached a boiling point. The community had always held Sheriff Michael Johnson in the highest regard, but the news of his affair with his niece, and the pregnancy that followed, left many residents feeling betrayed. Some spoke of their own suspicions that had lingered for years, citing moments where they had seen the sheriff's attention toward Jasmine growing too intense, too personal. It was clear that something had been wrong for much longer than anyone realized. Rumors about the affair spread like wildfire, and it wasn't long before the media got wind of the story. The once unassailable reputation of Sheriff Johnson was now tarnished beyond repair. His position as sheriff was called into question, and pressure mounted from both the public and his own department to step down. The media frenzy only added to the chaos, with news outlets focusing on every detail of the affair and Jasmine's pregnancy, feeding the public's insatiable need for scandal and betrayal. But Michael Johnson had more to lose than just his job. His reputation was in tatters, but it was his own family that threatened to expose him completely. A man who had once held power over everyone in the town was now cornered by his own actions, and he would do anything to stop the tide from swallowing him whole. The affair had begun as a selfish act of indulgence, but now it had become a ticking time bomb. The final straw came when Jasmine informed Michael that she intended to go public. She was done hiding in the shadows, done living in fear. Her decision to speak out was the ultimate challenge to his authority, a breaking point that pushed him to the edge. She had finally taken control of her own narrative, and Michael saw it as a direct threat to everything he had worked for, his power, his status. In the early hours of the morning on September 15, 2021, Sheriff Michael Johnson found himself standing at a crossroads, a moment that would forever change the course of his life and the lives of everyone in Madison County. Jasmine Turner, his niece, had finally made her decision. She would speak out. Her words, once a whisper, now felt like a roar in Michael's ears. She had declared her intention to go public, to expose their affair, their secret, and the pregnancy that was the product of their illicit relationship. But for Michael, this wasn't just about a personal scandal. It was about survival. He knew that if the truth came out, everything he had built, the trust, the authority, the reputation, would be destroyed. His family, his career, and his position as sheriff were all on the line. And so, on that night, he made the decision that would haunt him forever: to silence Jasmine, to end the threat she posed to his carefully constructed life. The crime, when it occurred, was anything but a spur-of-the-moment decision. It had been months in the making, a culmination of fear, rage, and desperation. Michael had been driven to the brink by the weight of his secret, and as the truth grew closer to exposure, he knew he could not allow Jasmine to ruin him. His once calculated, calm demeanor shattered under the pressure, replaced by a man who had lost all sense of reason. The murder itself was cold, methodical, and, in many ways, calculated. Jasmine had been staying at a small, isolated cabin on the outskirts of town, one that Michael had insisted she used to get away from the stress of the situation. He had told her it would help her clear her mind, allow her to process everything that was happening. But the cabin, far removed from the safety of family and the comfort of home, would become the scene of a gruesome tragedy. At around 2:30 a.m. on September 15th, Michael arrived at the cabin. He told Jasmine he wanted to have one final conversation, to settle things once and for all. But when he walked through the door, Jasmine was already packing her bags. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back. The tension was palpable, as the two of them stood there in the dim light of the cabin, the silence between them heavy with unsaid words. What happened in that cabin remains unclear, but the evidence gathered by investigators paints a horrifying picture of violence. Witnesses later described hearing screams, followed by the sound of objects being knocked over. The struggle that ensued was brutal. Jasmine fought back with everything she had, but Michael, using his superior strength, was determined to end the conflict once and for all. The sheriff had brought with him a handgun, and in that moment of fury, he shot his niece multiple times at point-blank range. The body, slumped on the floor, was a testament to the violence of the attack. A stark, tragic end to a life that had been filled with so much promise. When investigators arrived at the scene, they were met with a grisly sight. Jasmine's body had been left in the center of the cabin, her clothes torn, her face contorted in pain. It was clear that she had tried to defend herself. Bloodstains and defensive wounds on her hands indicated that she had fought for her life. The sheriff had made no effort to cover up the crime. Instead, he had left her body exposed, a chilling statement about his belief that he could control the narrative. The crime scene itself was a surreal and haunting tableau. The walls were splattered with blood, evidence of the violent struggle that had taken place. A broken window indicated that Jasmine had tried to escape, but it was too late. The sheriff had ensured that she would never leave the cabin alive. First, Michael attempted to cover his tracks, telling investigators that Jasmine had been the victim of a random break-in. He claimed that someone had entered the cabin, attacked her, and fled the scene. But as investigators combed through the evidence, inconsistencies began to emerge. There were no signs of forced entry into the cabin, and the trajectory of the bullets suggested that the shooter had been standing close to Jasmine when they were fired. The lack of evidence supporting Michael's story immediately raised suspicions. It didn't take long for law enforcement to focus their attention on the sheriff. His behavior, which had once seemed calm and collected, now appeared frantic and erratic. Witnesses reported seeing him driving away from the cabin the morning after the murder, his face pale and his hands shaking. By the time investigators arrived at the scene, Michael had already made several phone calls to his colleagues in the department, warning them that the investigation would be complicated and urging them to stick to the facts. The breakthrough in the case came when forensic experts examined the evidence at the crime scene. A trail of blood led investigators to a nearby storage shed, where they found Michael's fingerprints on a broken window. They also discovered a spent shell casing near the body that matched a weapon registered to Michael himself. The forensic evidence was damning, but it wasn't just the physical evidence that pointed to his guilt. His emotional state in the hours after the murder betrayed him. Interviews with his colleagues revealed that he had been acting strangely, withdrawing from his duties, and showing signs of distress. Michael Johnson, once the pillar of his community, was beginning to unravel before their eyes as the investigation progressed. More details came to light. A witness came forward who had seen Michael arguing with Jasmine just hours before her death. Another witness recalled hearing strange sounds coming from the cabin in the dead of night. Sounds that didn't match the usual noises associated with a break-in. Slowly, the case took shape, and the truth became undeniable. The sheriff had murdered his niece, not in some spontaneous act of violence, but as a calculated measure to protect his secrets. The public's reaction to the crime was one of disbelief and horror. Michael Johnson had been a fixture in Madison County, a man who had once been viewed as above reproach. Now, his actions had shattered the trust of an entire community. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented. News outlets from across the country descended on Madison County, eager to cover the story of the sheriff's betrayal. The town, once peaceful and tight-knit, was now thrust into the spotlight, its reputation forever stained by the actions of one of its most respected figures. But the tragedy of Jasmine's death was felt most acutely by her family. Her parents, devastated by the loss of their daughter, were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered family. They had trusted Michael, had thought of him as a protector. Now, they had to face the reality that it was the very man they had trusted most who had caused their daughter's death. The grief, the anger, and the disbelief were overwhelming, and the family vowed to seek justice for Jasmine, no matter the cost, as the community of Madison County struggled to come to terms with the horror that had unfolded in their midst. One question lingered in the air. How could a man who had sworn to serve and protect end up committing such a heinous act? The truth, as it turned out, was far darker than anyone had imagined, and the murder of Jasmine Turner would leave an indelible mark on the town's history, a tragedy that would never be forgotten. The arrest of Sheriff Michael Johnson marked the beginning of the end of a saga that had rocked the small town of Madison County to its core. But even in the darkest moments of the investigation, the true weight of the crime seemed unimaginable. The sheriff, the man sworn to protect the public, the man who wore the badge of authority, had betrayed everything he stood for, and in doing so, he had irreparably shattered the lives of those closest to him. His niece, Jasmine Turner, had become a tragic victim of a web of deception, fear, and abuse of power. Yet, while her family was left in mourning, the aftermath of the sheriff's arrest would continue to unravel in ways no one could have predicted. It was early in the morning on September 17, 2021, when the arrest finally took place. A team of detectives and federal agents surrounded Michael Johnson's home, a modest two-story house on the outskirts of town. The street was eerily quiet, as residents awoke to the shocking news that the man they had known for years, the man who had built his reputation on trust and law enforcement, was about to be taken into custody. Michael had been asleep when the authorities arrived, his demeanor calm, but his eyes were wide with realization. The jig was up. There was no escaping the tidal wave of evidence that had been steadily building against him. But it wasn't just the physical evidence, footage from security cameras, forensic reports, and the damning phone records that sealed Michael's fate. It was the multitude of calls and messages from law enforcement insiders, the web of connections he had tried to manipulate to cover his tracks, and his increasingly erratic behavior in the days leading up to the murder. It was these connections, these acts of desperation to control the investigation, that exposed his true character. Michael had relied on his position of power and trust within the community to try to avoid scrutiny. But in the end, the weight of his betrayal could no longer be hidden behind the badge. When the authorities arrived at his house, Michael was unprepared for the gravity of the situation. He stood in the doorway, flanked by officers, as his neighbors watched in silence from across the street. There was no resistance, no fight, just the quiet resignation of a man who knew he had been caught. His arrest made headlines across the country, but for the people of Madison County, the reality of what had just transpired hit like a freight train. How could it be that the man who was once their sheriff, a man they had trusted to uphold the law, had committed such an unforgivable act? The town was reeling from the shock of betrayal. Their faith in the very system meant to protect them shattered in a single moment. The investigation that followed would reveal a series of dark secrets about Michael Johnson, secrets that had been buried deep beneath the surface of his public persona. As authorities delved deeper into the case, they uncovered Michael's attempts to influence the investigation from the inside. In the hours following Jasmine's murder, Michael had made several phone calls to colleagues in law enforcement, urging them to stay the course and not stray from the narrative of a random break-in gone wrong. He had told his deputies that there was no need to investigate further, that there were no leads to follow, and that the case should be considered closed. The very people he had sworn to protect were now his potential allies in covering up his crime. The investigation team, however, was not so easily swayed. They dug deeper, unearthing more pieces of the puzzle. They analyzed phone records, tracing every conversation Michael had made in the critical hours leading up to the murder, and linking his calls to his colleagues' phones. They reviewed the security footage from the convenience store and nearby gas stations, and there it was. Michael's truck, parked just yards from where the body of Jasmine Turner had been found. The pieces of evidence all pointed back to him. But still, he remained steadfast in his denial, refusing to admit guilt. Michael's arrest did not come without a sense of drama. The town had been divided. There were some who still believed in his innocence, some who felt he had been a victim of circumstance, and then there were those who were just waiting for the inevitable, the moment when the law would catch up to him. But for the family of Jasmine Turner, the news was a cruel confirmation of their worst fears. They had always known that Michael's relationship with Jasmine was inappropriate, but never in their wildest dreams had they imagined that it would lead to her death. Now, they were faced with the unspeakable. A family member, the sheriff himself, had taken their daughter's life as the day of the arrest unfolded. The media descended on Madison County like vultures, eager to report on the arrest of the sheriff. For the press, it was a story that practically wrote itself. A sheriff accused of murdering his own niece, with a trail of evidence pointing directly to him. But for the residents of Madison County, it was more than just another headline. It was a devastating betrayal of trust. It was a reflection of how power, when left unchecked, could corrupt even the most sacred of relationships. The news coverage of Michael's arrest was nothing short of sensational. Local stations, national news networks, and even international outlets broadcasted the details of the case. The family of Jasmine Turner became the focal point of the media frenzy. Their pain and grief laid bare for the world to see. Interviews with family members, law enforcement officials, and experts flooded the airwaves, each one offering a new perspective on the case. But despite the onslaught of media attention, one thing became clear: the people of Madison County would never look at their sheriff the same way again. Following the arrest, the case quickly moved into the legal realm, where the full weight of Michael's actions would be exposed. His trial was set for the spring of 2022, and already the case had garnered intense public interest. For Jasmine's family, the trial would be their chance to seek justice, not just for Jasmine, but for the entire community. They had lost their daughter, their niece, in the most brutal and senseless of ways. Now they would fight for her in the court of law. The trial itself was a spectacle. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse each day, with reporters and news cameras capturing every moment. Inside, the proceedings were no less intense. Michael's defense attorneys attempted to argue that his actions had been influenced by the pressure of his job, that he had been under emotional duress due to his strained relationship with Jasmine, and that he had not intended to kill her. They tried to present a case for diminished capacity, suggesting that Michael's mental state at the time of the murder had been compromised. But the prosecution's case was strong. They presented the physical evidence: bloodstains at the scene, Michael's fingerprints found on the broken window, the trajectory of the bullets that indicated he had fired the fatal shots at close range. They highlighted Michael's phone calls, his desperate attempts to cover his tracks, and his manipulation of his colleagues. The evidence painted a damning picture of a man who had gone to extreme lengths to conceal his crime and protect himself from the consequences. On the final day of the trial, both sides made their closing arguments. The prosecution described the crime as a cold, calculated act, driven by fear and a desperate need to maintain control. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint Michael as a victim of circumstance, a man who had been pushed to the brink. But the jury was unmoved by the defense's arguments. The weight of the evidence against Michael was too overwhelming. It took just over 12 hours for the jury to deliberate, and when they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty of first-degree murder. Michael Johnson's sentencing hearing was scheduled for a week after the verdict was rendered. The courtroom was filled with Jasmine's family, friends, and community members, all awaiting the judge's final decision. In his ruling, the judge described the crime as one of the most heinous betrayals of trust he had ever encountered. He emphasized that Michael's actions had not only resulted in the murder of his niece, but had also destroyed the fabric of the community he had once served. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Michael would never be free again to hurt anyone. For Jasmine's family, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. They had lost their loved one, and no amount of justice could ever bring her back. But they took comfort in knowing that Michael Johnson would never again walk the streets as a free man. They hoped that the trial would serve as a reminder to others of the importance of accountability, of the need to protect those who are vulnerable, and of the enduring consequences of unchecked power. For Madison County, however, the damage was deeper. Trust in law enforcement was shattered, and the scars left by Michael's betrayal would take generations to heal. The case of Sheriff Michael Johnson would live on in the collective memory of the town, a symbol of how the pursuit of power can destroy everything in its path. While Jasmine's family would struggle with the weight of their loss for the rest of their lives, the town would continue to reckon with the lessons this tragedy had taught them about trust, justice, and the fragility of the human soul. Michael Johnson's legacy would forever be defined by the horror he had brought upon his own family and community, a reminder that even those who are entrusted with the law can turn into the very criminals they are meant to protect against. As we reach the end of this tragic and complex story, there's one question that lingers. What drove Sheriff Michael Johnson to commit such an unimaginable crime? Was this crime something that was bound to happen, the result of years of pent-up secrets and abuses of power? Or was it an avoidable tragedy, a series of choices that could have been stopped if only someone had seen the signs? We may never fully understand what drove Michael to such extremes, but the answers lie somewhere deep within the fractured relationships and twisted desires that led to this deadly conclusion. What do you think? Was this crime inevitable, or was there a way out? Do you believe that Michael Johnson's position of power played a critical role in this horrific act? Or perhaps it was his desperation to hide a forbidden relationship gone too far? Take a moment to reflect, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Was this a case of a man consumed by guilt? Or was there something darker, something much more deliberate at play? This is a case that leaves us with more questions than answers, and we want to hear what you think. Theories, insights, and reflections are always welcome here. If this story left you speechless, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on future true crime stories that unravel the darkest aspects of human nature. There are always more stories, more shocking betrayals, and more unsolved mysteries to explore. And make sure to hit that notification bell so you'll be the first to know when our next video drops. In next week's episode, we'll dive into another shocking scandal. This time, it's a tale of power, betrayal, and murder, where a trusted public figure will once again prove that no one is above the law. Trust us, you won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching, and remember, in the world of true crime, nothing is ever as it seems. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and always question the stories you're told. Until next time.